Good evening, everyone. My name is David Kent. I'm the president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, and welcome to tonight's special December program. As all of you know, we normally have a guest speaker. Today, we have our two guest speakers who are longtime members of the Lincoln Group of DC, and in fact, members of the board. So we're doing something a little bit different. Tonight we're going to have a debate and a discussion among members on a provocative topic about Lincoln. Was he a cautious leader or was he an audacious leader? So here's how it's going to work. After I finish this introduction, we're going to take a vote amongst everybody on this call, which is right now 46 people. And we're going to get your initial position. Do you think he's cautious or do you think he was audacious? Then I'm going to turn it over to Ed Epstein and Richard Margulies, who are going to talk about, first Ed's going to talk about whether Lincoln was cautious and the evidence for that. And then Richard will talk about why he thinks Lincoln was audacious. So following their presentations, we're going to throw things open to the members for comments, questions, discussions, directed at Ed and Richard or to anybody else. Again, we'll do this live, so keep your mute button on until you're ready to speak, and then you could open up your mic and offer it, and I'll try to referee if we get too many people trying to talk at once. So we're looking for a robust but always respectful conversation. We want to hear people's viewpoints, give examples, and at the end, we're going to vote again, and we're going to see if anybody's minds were changed. So we hope to wrap this up by 8 p.m. Eastern time. Some of you are not on Eastern time. So by way of introduction, I'll just want to give you a little bit from two prominent Lincoln photographers. First, David Herbert Donald in his biography of Lincoln, which was 1995. He really presented Lincoln more as a cautious leader. He said that he was reluctant to take the initiative and make bold plans. He preferred to respond to the actions of others. Donald also said he did not come to conclusions quickly, and he was temperamentally averse to making bold moves. It was his style to react to decisions made by others rather than take the initiative himself. Now, in contrast, a more recent book that came out this past year by Richard Striner talks about Lincoln as a more audacious leader. So this book is called Summoned to Glory, The Audacious Life of Abraham Lincoln. And Striner says that Lincoln had the qualities that the single him out among many intelligent leaders whose deeds may be studied with profit may be laid out as follows. His ability to orchestrate power, his adroitness in using that power strategically, his commitment to use the power that he wielded in order to protect, and this point is often unappreciated, his audacity. Striner added that in order to roll back slavery, he took tremendous risks that put everything he treasured on the line. The case he made without the strategic brilliance of Lincoln, the anti-slavery movement might have failed. So now we'll turn it over to Ed, who will present Lincoln as a cautious leader.
No, we're going to vote first.
Ah, you're right. I'm sorry, Ed. We're going to vote first. So I guess the easiest way to vote is just hold up your hand if you think Lincoln was an audacious leader. We'll see how many we get. And hold them up. Especially since you keep jumping around. Okay. And cautious. Okay. And you people who aren't on video, if you're holding up your hand, either either come online and show me your hand, or just send me a note in the chat. And I can see there are several people who have put things in the chat, and including at least 2 people who said both. But I'm going to give a slight edge to audacious. It looks like maybe 20 people of the people who voted say audacious, and maybe 12 who said cautious. Those aren't exact numbers, especially since so many people aren't on video or didn't send the note. So we have, it's fairly evenly divided, slightly more towards audacious. So Ed, I think you need to convince some people.
Okay. So Richard Margulies and I proposed this idea because we thought it would be good, instead of having the usual author talk, to have a discussion among our members who are very knowledgeable about Abraham Lincoln. That's why we belong to the Abraham Lincoln group. And also we decided then that line that we would each speak for about 7 to 10 minutes and then throw it open. And hopefully we'll have time for about an hour of questions, discussions, polite argument, whatever.
No.
So I begin. In thinking about tonight's discussion, I first had to come up with the definition for the word audacity, what I define it as. To me, it means daring, getting out in front of public opinion, and taking a damn the torpedoes approach to problems. None of these things apply in the main to President Abraham Lincoln. Cagey, wily, wise, surely. Pragmatic, often slow moving, willing to try a new thing when his earlier ideas faltered, yes. And cautious above all. I will argue that the most audacious thing that Lincoln did during his so eventful presidency was his first major decision, about which he brooked no debate and never considered any alternative. He was going to preserve the Union no matter what. This was his end all and be all, and he made this momentous decision without knowing how it would play out over the course of his presidency. It was a bold leap into the unknown. A lesser president, say James Buchanan, his predecessor, would have meekly accepted secession, which would have probably led to more secession, and we would have had 4 or 5 countries in what is the United States. But at the same moment, Lincoln took a cautious yet smart step in building his so-called team of rivals cabinet. His decision to hold rivals like Seward and Chase close to him was a brilliant ploy, but very cautious, because it showed that Lincoln figured it was better to keep ambitious potential rivals right at hand and force them to buy into administration policies rather than have them engage in full-time mischief making on the outside. And as it was, he had to cope with these 2 guys mischief making, especially Chase. Lincoln's handling of his often bumbling or timid or scheming generals in the first 2 years of the Civil War again showed his caution. Putting up with the preening, slow-moving, self-promoting, and possibly disloyal George McClellan, Lincoln showed that he had to find a way through those who advocated different ways of fighting to suppress the pro-slavery and anti-union rebellion. As Lincoln biographer David Herbert Donald, who David has quoted already, put it, quote, militarily in 1862-63, Lincoln stood in the middle between military commanders like McClellan, who advocated minimal impact on civilians, and ultras like Joseph Hooker, who wanted to bring the war to Southern civilians, unquote. That dilemma formed a portrait of the Lincoln presidency and helped explain his cautious, pragmatic, step-by-step approach to big issues. Lincoln understood he was the leader of a very shaky coalition. Radical Republicans, conservative Republicans, war Democrats, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Unionists who wanted to defeat secession while leaving slavery alone where it already existed, and the border states where fealty to the United States was always shaky. No wonder Lincoln seemed to zig and zag, hem and haw, await for events to play out to let him make a decisive move. As Lincoln himself put it, quote, I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me, unquote. We're all familiar with Lincoln's circuitous path to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln's promulgation of the Emancipation Proclamation, try to say that a few times fast, was preceded by 2 years of pressure from a restive Congress firmly controlled by the radical Republicans, empowered by Southerners' decision to abandon their seats in the House and Senate. They had passed 2 confiscation acts aimed at freeing some slaves for compensation to their owners, and they prodded Lincoln to do more. Both confiscation acts were pretty unsuccessful in getting anyone to free their slaves. As Fergus Bordwich, a historian who has written on the wartime Congress, put it, quote, while Lincoln's announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation was a bold political stroke, it had only been made possible as a result of many months of debate in the House and Senate and the ceaseless personal prodding of the radicals in Congress. Even as he announced the Emancipation Proclamation, due to take effect in January 1, 1863, Lincoln used his annual message to Congress in December 1862 to propose 3 constitutional amendments, which showed that even as he boldly freed some of the slaves, he remained cautious about the prospects for an America where whites and blacks could coexist. His plan, which went nowhere in the radical Republican Congress, showed that Lincoln was thinking of a long road to abolition by providing compensation to states that abolished slavery by 1900. He also sought money for colonizing ex-slaves abroad voluntarily, and a law that would say that slave owners whose slaves were freed during the Civil War would be reimbursed for their loss. So in 1863, Lincoln was still thinking of a constitutional state-by-state approach to freeing all of the 4 million slaves, a process that could take years and years. Only subsequent events pushed him into advocating for a constitutional ban on slavery, which became the 13th Amendment. By saying Lincoln was cautious, I'm not by any means demeaning his greatness, his vision, or his continued importance to us today. That's why we're here studying him. But I am saying that he used events that came along to move down his chosen path. For instance, if the United States had prevailed at the first Battle of Bull Run in June or July of 1861, there would have been no Emancipation Proclamation, as rebel states were reabsorbed into the Union. The road to abolition would have been much longer and far messier than it was. Even in his final days before his assassination, Lincoln was taking a cautious approach to Reconstruction, which again infuriated the radicals in Congress. In his final public address, I believe it was on April 11th, 1865, he proposed giving the vote to a small percentage of freed Black men in Louisiana, a step that was far short of what the radical Republicans in Congress wanted, but yet a step that so infuriated the racist John Wilkes Booth, who vowed upon hearing Lincoln's words delivered from the south balcony of the White House to a crowd gathered below, that he would assassinate him, which he carried out 3 days later. Again, Lincoln tragically found himself caught in the middle. It's a story of his presidency, always in the middle. This time between 2 irreconcilable sides. Even in moderation, he paid the supreme price for moving ahead on racial equality. As Bordwich put it, quote, Lincoln was a cautious moderate whose step-by-step approach produced a revolution that was cut short by the undoing of Reconstruction, unquote. Thank you.
Okay, so Richard, do you
Yeah.
have can you counter that?
Yes, let me start by Ed surprised me when he pointed out that Lincoln was a visionary, and he used events, if I caught your words exactly, to achieve his vision. And that is a fundamental premise of my, excuse me a second.
That
That,
Lincoln,
that was a fundamental premise of what I want to talk about, because as a psychologist, I'm interested in understanding Lincoln as a person and what his personality was and his goal in life. And following the insights of my colleague, Michael Maccabee, who's a psychoanalyst and an anthropologist who I've worked with for 50 years, has written a great deal about visionaries. Michael defines a visionary personality as a person whose life is dedicated to changing the world. And Michael points out that there are 5 elements that you see in a visionary. And visionaries, I hasten to point out, are fairly rare personalities. Although we all have visionary elements in our personality, to be dominantly a visionary like Lincoln, you see 5 prominent elements. Foresight is one. Looking ahead, seeing the context. Visioning, that is creating a vision of how that person wants to change the world, and a process to bring about that vision, which we can call visioning. A third element is systems thinking. The visionary thinks about the full context of factors that are affecting them as they try to achieve their vision. As Ed says, uses events. Lincoln used events to achieve his vision. That's an example of systems thinking. A fourth element of visionaries is partnering. These people know how to partner with different groups and different individuals to achieve their vision. And they show relative uninterest in people who don't share their vision or who won't partner with them. And the fifth element is they're very good at motivating people who they want to move, which is the meaning of motivate. They want to move toward their vision. Now, personality describes important purposes of a person, but there are other elements that describe a person. So Abraham Lincoln had a high degree of strategic intelligence, and I think Ed was making comments about that regard. That's a particular kind of intelligence. We all don't have a high quantity of strategic intelligence, but in Lincoln, you see a brilliance in his strategic intelligence. He also had a high degree of personality intelligence. That is, he really understood people. He could quickly read a person and see, what would I have to do to connect, to move this person? Both are very important to understanding Lincoln as a leader. And he was a principled pragmatist. That is, he had a vision and he had principles. And he would, as Ed said, use events in order to pragmatically move toward his vision. And he had a deep self-confidence and belief in himself. And he knew that he had to achieve and hold on to power. And he knew he had to manage those people around him and in the country in order to achieve his vision. In terms of audacious, the word audacious, not a word I chose, but it's key to what we're talking about. The dictionary says, showing a willingness to make surprising, bold risky decisions, surprisingly bold. That is surprising to what normal people do. And the other element is showing an impudent lack of respect. And I think these are qualities that you can also see in Abraham Lincoln, taking surprisingly bold decisions that other people had not thought about, which he does on his own. He makes initiatives, and he's not concerned with whether people like them, but he's concerned with how he can affect people and move them. So his secretary, John Hay, said, for example, and I think it's important because Hay spent so much time in intimate contact with him. John Hay said, quote, "The old man sits here and wields like a backwoods Jupiter the bolts of war and the machinery of government with a hand especially steady and equally firm. He is devilish near an autocrat in his administration." Hardly a cautious description of somebody. General Grant said of his commander-in-chief, quote, "He always had a firm will and a clear policy." Grant was very brief and to the point, but I think also not a cautious description. Frederick Douglass believed Lincoln's audacity depended on the context. Frederick Douglass said, viewed from, quote, "viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined." End quote. So let's look at foresight briefly, which is looking ahead, paying attention to context, as Frederick Douglass said. And we would say today, even though Lincoln didn't use this term, the context was the racism that's inherent in American history. So he didn't declare himself an abolitionist because he knew abolitionism could tear the country farther apart than it already was. He saw the country as it was and the citizenry as it was, looking always for openings that he could make wider and move forward and move decisively when those openings allowed. He was always thinking strategically, able to change his mind when there was a reason to do it, but not for crass popularity. And he was purposeful in his self-denigration. He was willing to put himself down or to appear modest, and he refused to be self-promoting, which is almost un-American. While at the same time, he was shrewdly making the moves to advance to levers of power where he could more likely achieve his vision. His war strategy was later called total war because he thought systemically and looked ahead at what was necessary. As a visionary, he was always keeping the strategic purpose in mind: destroy slavery as an institution, because it was not only morally wrong, but because it held back the common good and development of the country. In his Gettysburg Address, he focused on the Declaration of Independence, which is centered on, quote, "the proposition that all men are created equal." He didn't focus on the Constitution, which made slavery legal. In terms of systems thinking, he was always interested in science as a transformative power in society. Speaking to Wisconsin farmers, he encouraged them to be more scientific. He was interested in educating Americans, the Land Grant Act, the 1861 plan to buy out all of Delaware's slaves, the way he handled West Virginia's statehood. Again, I just want to emphasize that when we talk about audacious, we're talking about his purpose and his actions to achieve that purpose. We're not looking at his immediate behavior. I agree with Ed. If you look at a particular small segment of behavior, you could say, why did it take him so long? Why did he dither, etc.? But if you look at a visionary is focused on the purpose of changing the world, of, in this case,
19.
changing our country. That's what defines his audacity. Coming back to the points, in terms of foresight as a quality of a visionary, think about the fact that he was already thinking about Reconstruction after the war, before the war had even ended. He was already planning and working with constituencies in different places, for example, Louisiana. In terms of partnering, go back to how he related to his handlers who did what they had to do for his nomination in Chicago. How he worked with unionist elements in the states, in the insurrectionist states. You know, he was always looking, where could I find partners to work with me to achieve the vision? And of course, there was Grant, who was just such a find for him. You know, he finally found a partner who he could work with closely to achieve his vision. In terms of motivating, his public speaking was deeply researched and poignantly articulated. Still today, 156 years after his murder, he's quoted almost every week by both parties and often on the cable talkathons. His words still motivate us toward his vision, which was the vision of the white founders and also the vision of the enslaved, disempowered, and exploited of our country and of the world. He's still quoted around the world. This shows the power of his motivation and the fact that he worked so much to craft his words to motivate. And of course, his use of humor, which was very purposeful. It was very strategic. It was to disarm people and to touch people and to move people. And he brought to this quality of motivating a magnanimity about even the slave holders. He would see them as caught in the slave system also. And he wouldn't use labels to blame people and to dehumanize them, even those who opposed him. He always sought deep understanding, even of those who worked against him. For example, he was quoted as saying, "I don't like that person. I need to get to know him better." Another example of motivating is how he would stay with the colonization idea until he found a strategic opening where he could drop it and move forward and motivate people to a new level of thinking. Just a few more points. Or for example, when the 5 Baltimore African-American gentlemen came to the White House in the summer of 1863 to urge him to take a bolder move, he talked with them about colonization, and he never mentioned that in the desk where they were standing in his room was the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, because he knew strategically, if he was to tell them, they would go out and talk to newspaper people, and the word would go out before he was ready, and the circumstances, the context was ready for him to make that bold move. So the point I want to make is Abraham Lincoln was a visionary who was audacious in his purpose of changing the country. And he was very strategic about what he did in any particular context so that it would allow him and the country to move forward toward that vision. But if you look at any small segment of his behavior, you could conclude, as Ed was presenting, that, well, he was too cautious. I think, though, if you stay focused on his visionary personality, you see the audacity. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go back. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your applause. I'm going to go back and change this slightly and make it into a Lincoln Douglas type debate where your first person got 60 minutes. Obviously, this is truncated. We're not doing 60 minutes. The second person got 90 minutes, and then the first person got a 30-minute rejoinder. So I'm going to ask Ed if you want to have a few comments responding to Richard, and then we'll go and we'll open it up to everybody else, see what they think.
Well, I'll speak very briefly because I think there's 50 people on here and I think I want to hear from them. That was the whole point of this. I would point out, I think someone can be a visionary, but still be a cautious leader. Lincoln was only prepared to go as far as public opinion let him go, and as far as this shaky coalition let him go, and as far as he could get things through Congress. In Reconstruction, for instance, in his plan, was very lenient on the Confederate States, and he did not. He supported a Freedmen's Bureau. He supported education. He supported limited suffrage for blacks, especially for the black men who had served in the United States Army colored troops. But as Professor Donald points out, beyond this, he was not prepared to go. Unlike the radicals, he gave no thought to dividing up the estates of the defeated Southern planters and giving each black families 40 acres and a mule. He offered no opinions on school integration, interracial marriages, or social equality between blacks and whites. In April 1865, he thought these were all hypothetical questions, which could have no other effect than to divide the friends of the Union at a time when they ought to be united in a search for peace. This was the story of Lincoln's presidency. He always was in the middle. Now he was a very wise man. I'm not disputing that. He was a visionary. I'm not disputing that. But his style of leadership, his style of getting things done was very cautious. As I repeat, if the war had ended in 1861, that was as far as he was going to go for that time. He continued with the compensated emancipation right up until the war situation encouraged him to do it. And then he only took in colored troops because his generals, General Halleck told him, we need troops, and here's a few 100,000 men who are willing to serve, eager to serve. And he took them in the army. And of course, then the black soldiers confronted the unfairness of the pay they were given. They were paid a lot less than white soldiers, and a lot of them refused to accept pay in protest. Lincoln finally accepted that they should be paid equal pay. So it was a step-by-step approach, and he only went as far as the situation could handle it. He saw that he could do. And the radicals in Congress, who get a bad name through their Committee on the Conduct of the War, were always there prodding him. Now, I also have to raise one point that I know that Dr. Tom Peters on this call, my friend from the forum is on the call. The radical Republicans passed big pieces of domestic legislation, the first so-called progressive Congress in history. The land grant colleges, the Homestead Act, the Intercontinental Railroad. They created the Agriculture Department. They created the income tax. All these things Lincoln was for because they were all part of the old Whig platform. But Lincoln had almost nothing to do with passing them or negotiating them through Congress. In fact, James Buchanan had vetoed the land grant college and I believe the Homestead Act. And none other than a person than Stephen A. Douglas was the primary champion of the Transcontinental Railroad, although he died in June or July 1861. So Lincoln was there, he was present, he was occupied with the war, obviously, and he was fine with these things. But he would, and they passed overwhelmingly through the Congress, and he was eager to sign them. But again, this was just part of what he could do. He was president of the art of the possible. I think that was his genius. And other presidents who've studied him have shown the same thing. FDR was the same way. He wanted to appear to be pressured to do things. He knew what he wanted to do, but he wanted to be appeared to be pressured to do things. And he wouldn't do things that he saw would destroy his fragile coalition. For instance, the Senate constantly blocked the anti-lynching law. And his own wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Walter White of the NAACP repeatedly beseeched him to come out in favor of the anti-lynching legislation. But FDR told his wife, I can't do that. I would lose the solid South. Mississippi voted for FDR 4 times with over 90% of the vote. And he was terrified if he did these things like that, he would lose the solid South and all the social legislation that he continuously wanted to pass. He learned this lesson, I believe, from Lincoln. I'll leave it at that, and I hope we can get to some good discussion.
Please, if anybody has a comment, go ahead and open your mic and start a discussion.
Hello.
I'd like to respond directly to some of the things that Ed just said. I do suspect that Lincoln had a mix of what we would call cautious and audacious, but I wouldn't agree that he would only go so far as the public would allow him. I think what he was a master at, and he explained it at least once, I believe, that you can't get too far ahead of the public, and you have to work constantly at bringing them along in the direction you want to go. So it wasn't so much caution as the way he worked practically to stay just enough ahead to keep things moving without getting so far ahead that there would be a big backlash and derail everything. And that's a political art that's very difficult to pull off and takes some tremendous savvy. But I wouldn't call that caution. To me, caution usually has an element of fear of failure in it, and I don't see that in Lincoln. So, audacious may not be the right word, but he certainly wasn't willing to jump so far ahead as to lose everybody, which of course the abolitionists were. They didn't care whether the public came along or not. They were just focused on this is what's right, and so that's what we advocate for regardless. So he doesn't fit neatly, I think, in all of this, but I do think it's important to understand that he was always looking at the process of getting things where they needed to go.
As one of the minority who put up both hands, both audacious and cautious. He saw when he was a congressman between 1847 and 1849, and he was thinking about all of these speeches that he was listening to, all of it, and he was a very, very thorough thinker. And when he left Congress, he pretty much realized the whole country is divided already. It didn't have to wait for the Civil War to know that. And he said that the main arguments is either secession or get rid of slavery. And Lincoln did not see it as an either or. He saw it was possible to do both because European powers, France, for instance, they promoted republics and they promoted democracy. and yet they got rid of slavery. So why couldn't the United States do the same thing? So when it came to his vision, I want both the country to remain intact and to be rid of slavery. On those things, he was audacious. But when it came to the incremental steps as to how to get to the master vision, he was always easygoing. He didn't care exactly how that happened. And one of the things that I pointed out to the National Juneteenth folks is that the first act to emancipate slaves was in June 19th, 1862, when Lincoln signed the congressional bill to disavow slavery and in effect add the 13th Amendment to all the remaining territories of the United States, which was a campaign promise. I want to keep slavery out of the territories. And that was accomplished June 19th, 1862, long before he had the Emancipation Proclamation in his desk. And that was passed by Congress, but approved by Lincoln. Okay. No
Other
reaction.
thoughts by people? I think one thing, while people are thinking, one of the questions that comes up for me is in listening to the two of you is it seems like you had very different definitions of what audacious means. And I think that that's been true with what the people have been saying online so far. So, is it cautious and audacious really opposites of each other, which Carl just suggested they're not mutually exclusive? Is it more cautious versus reckless, or audacious versus timid? I mean, there's probably many other combinations of synonyms which are not strict synonyms. How do you exactly define each of those terms and apply them to someone like Lincoln, who I personally think was both complex and acted situationally? Ed, you had said that he was master of the doable or something like that. What could the possible? What could get done? Well, some of that could get done could only get done because of things he may have done in order to set the stage for those things to be done. And that's presented both as a statement and more of a hypothetical as well. So I think that's one of the things that pops up in my head as people are talking, that people have different ideas of what the definitions of those things are.
I want to compliment both David and Richard. Excellent points raised. But to your point, David, I think Ed got the leg up on you, Richard, when he first started off defining what he meant by, and then he went on and told us why his argument met the definition. That was powerful, but it was a nice technique, Ed. Well done. That's
Does anybody have anything they want to add? If not, I'll throw something else in.
Yeah, can I? It's Matt.
Go ahead, Matt.
I
We
tuned
can't
in late,
see
which is. I'm
Matt,
sorry. I'll do it. Okay, I'm eating Chinese food, but okay, you can see me. I want to say this: the comparison to Roosevelt that Ed did, I think is not quite right, because Lincoln was much more, I don't know whether the word cautious or strategic. Roosevelt went overboard a couple of times and really got his wrist slapped. Court packing. And I think his speech on the stab in the back by Italy, when Italy entered the war, also backfired. I don't think Lincoln never got too far ahead to get knocked down. So I think he actually, in those instances, Roosevelt had a much more of an ego problem. People told him court packing was going to be a disaster, but he went ahead with it. And so I don't think Lincoln made a mistake of that size. So I don't quite know what the word is. I think he was less egotistical than Lincoln and didn't get as carried away.
I'd like to respond to that if that would be okay. I think a lot of people, especially Democrats, would have considered the emancipation, the preliminary emancipation, a massive overreach. And the Republicans got pounded in the elections in 1862. They didn't lose control, they didn't lose control of the Senate, but they certainly took a pounding in losing several governorships. So I look at Lincoln as a little bit on the lines of Ed, of he was a master of the art of the achievable. And that's how I like to put it. So I see Lincoln as, a lot of people like to say, okay, can we frame him as a conservative? Can we frame him as a progressive? I think Lincoln was the master conservator, trying to protect those grand things, the grand principles that were established by the founders that he saw the need to protect. And as circumstances allowed, creep forward. He definitely wanted, he set the boundary, slavery will not go into the territories. And if I can keep slavery out of the territories, I think I can put slavery on the course of ultimate extinction. That he held to, as he said he would. As far as I really liked how John, or how it was brought up that you're taking Frederick Douglass' speech and parsing what Lincoln was. And in that speech, you see that context was everything. For the abolitionists, they were badly disappointed in Lincoln. For the conservative Republicans, they were badly disappointed in Lincoln. So, but he still managed to navigate that very narrow, and this is where the wisdom and the conservator in Lincoln come into play, in my opinion. He was able to navigate that very narrow, achievable path that brought ultimate success.
Mhm.
There's a hand up. David, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I saw somebody raise their hand and I'm not sure who it was now.
John Keller.
John, go ahead.
This is a passage I've carried with me all these years. Teddy White, making him the president, he wrote something about leadership, and he said the leader should be far enough ahead of his people that he can look ahead and see what awaits. He can't be so far ahead that when he looks back, there aren't a sufficient number of people behind him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fine line where you set that. But that's really what you've got to do. You just can't go with the people. But if you go too far, you won't have the following. I thought it was just masterfully written.
Do you see that as being cautious or audacious?
I always feel about labels that they're inadequate. Labels are inadequate.
Could I?
Because that could be taken both ways. I mean, you
Yeah.
could say that, well, he was waiting for the public to tell him what was okay to do. On the other hand, he was kind of leading the public along
You
to
can
get
lead.
them to a point where he could
can
do what he
lead.
wanted to do.
You can lead and still be cautious. That's my point.
Could
Yeah,
I pick up on John's point?
like a
Um,
chess.
Hold
like
on a
chess
second, John.
grandmaster, he could be both. You could be cautious, thinking out your strategy 3 or 4 moves ahead, and audacious, and when the trap is set, move forward. Lincoln, everybody agrees, read a lot, history, etc. 4 years of studying Euclidean democracy in the late, or Euclidean geometry, 1856 on. But he was both cautious because he read newspapers more than anything else, always reading public opinion, always to understand public opinion. And he realized, he concluded public opinion was more powerful than any constitutional or Declaration of Independence principle. And he was both cautious, thinking his next moves, but and audacious, moving forward at the right time. He disciplined Fremont for declaring slavery free, freeing slaves in the Missouri area too early, and he moved forward with the Emancipation Proclamation with Seward's advice in an appropriate time frame, and very cautiously, but also very audaciously, because he at the start of the war himself didn't think that slavery could end in his lifetime. I think we should vote for both. Ed and Richard have both made very strong arguments for their positions, but Lincoln's too great to be pinned down to one or the other. So with what I've heard so far.
Could I just respond to John Keller's point? I agree with the quote that John Keller mentioned. My approach is to say that Lincoln's audacity was in his vision. When you look at the context of the country, where people were essentially ready to kill each other, and when the war started actually to kill each other over this fundamental division, and yet he held firm to his audacious vision, and he was very pragmatic and strategic about what the context allowed, so he could move toward that audacious vision.
That was it. I don't know if we're just playing with words here or what, but to me, that means he was cautious. He took the steps that he could to achieve it. So I think a classic example of Lincoln, which I think someone here pointed out in the chat, was it Larry or someone else, was Lincoln's maneuvering of Jefferson Davis to fire the first shot at Fort Sumter. It's a classic, shrewd, wily guy from the frontier, a good judge of people, but it was a cautious, step-by-step approach to make sure that it was the rebels, the traitors who fired the first shot on the United States. Not that he was putting down the other Americans. He wanted the rebels to fire at his forces, and that's exactly what he accomplished. It was a cautious, step-by-step, wise approach.
I have a question for Ed. Ed, do you see a difference between being cautious and being careful?
First of all, I want to say I'm dying of hunger here watching Matt Fink eat his Chinese food, probably from Mei Hua, right, Matt? That's a Chinese restaurant in our neighborhood. Cautious and careful. Let's see, what does careful mean? Well, I mean, he was.
Well, Richard, how is careful different from cautious in your definition?
As Carol Francis Johnston said earlier, cautious implies some fear.
No.
That one is careful to not do anything risky that might hurt, that might cause pain. Careful implies a strategic weighing of what will be affected.
Well, to me, it's the opposite. A cautious approach is one that says this is what we can get done, and we'll do step by step. It's a cautious approach. What we can get through, what we can get through the Congress, what we can get through the public opinion, what we can get into law, what we can accomplish on the battlefield. It reminds me of the debate over the Affordable Care Act in 2009, 2010. Originally they were going to include dental care, which would have been a major, big thing for people's health, because dental care for many, many millions of Americans is so terrible. But they decided it made it too big and it was going to be too difficult to get that through. So they dropped it. That was a cautious approach to let's do it so we can keep our coalition together. The same thing when Social Security was debated under FDR, they excluded domestic help because a lot of African-American women were domestics and the Southerners weren't going to pay their maids and house servants pay into this system. So to get the votes to do it, they dropped it. And it wasn't until this congresswoman who recently died, Eddie Bernice Johnson, in the early 1990s, insisted on finally expanding it for these millions of employees to get that. So you take what you can get, you do what you can do now. And Matt's right, FDR on occasion badly overreached. He had these fits of grandeur and it brought him down. But you have to be cautious, pragmatic. I mean, you can use other words, but that's what you have to do to be an effective leader, an effective president. I see someone else here has a hand up.
I think that's John Swallow from before.
Oh, okay.
Can I add something?
Bradley?
Yes. I think when I first read that this program was going to be presented, I looked up the definition of audacious, and it said it was an adjective. It was extremely bold or daring, recklessly brave and fearless. And I thought that, how does a president in a republic with checks and balances, exactly how does one execute that? You know, that sounds more like, in terms of government, like an autocrat. If Lincoln had respect for anything, he had respect for the Constitution. And the Constitution, I think itself, kind of negates against being so audacious. When I study the 19th century, I always like to look back and see what the contemporaries said about certain individuals. And when I looked that up, William Herndon, Lincoln's last law partner, said that he never ran in advance of his age. Republican leader James Blaine shared that Lincoln preferred to somewhere in the rear rather than too far in advance of public judgment. Lincoln was a politician, and I'm not using that as a pejorative. I'm using that as someone who respects the opinions and thoughts of the people who put him into office. And I think that, you know, Lincoln was very much aware of his limitations, but he's also very much aware of the prejudices of the people that put him in office and how far that he could go. To be sure, he had audacious people around him, so he knew what that looked like. I'm thinking about Fremont, who, when he was commander of the West, took steps to confiscate the property of the rebels, including their slaves. General Hunter, when he was commander of the South, well, as soon as he got down, he started handing out certificates of freedom. Lincoln overruled all of these folks because they were not presidents and they were not responsible for prosecuting the war and keeping the border states in line and keeping the races in the North from abandoning his cause. So I think that Lincoln, respect for the Constitution, I think tempered his audacity somewhat, as I think that the Constitution would temper any leader's audacity here. So I think that he was, and I hate to use the word because it seemed like a cop out of being cautiously audacious, but I think that he tried to do what he could do under the circumstances. I think he may have had audacious ideas, but they were tempered by what he thought he could get through. Ed, I mentioned something that I, talked to Henry about earlier, that on the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation, with his December message to Congress, he put things out that kind of blunted the Emancipation Proclamation. He was ready to extend slavery into the 1900s, possibly. He was willing to, of course, he was trying to think of what he could do state by state, but he was always cautious, even in his audacity. He was always thinking, trying to gauge public opinion and the things men would fight for and would die for, and what the country would accept. So I think that he was cautiously audacious, but he kind of came down on the side of caution. So I would support Ed's position there, and I appreciate what both speakers said. Thank you.
Okay,
Miles
so I have
says,
well,
go ahead, Rod, go ahead.
I have a question for Richard. After Gettysburg, Lincoln was ever so disappointed that Meade didn't finish off Lee and caused the war to have ended in 1863. Had the war not ended when it did, knowing Lincoln's strategic thinking, how do you think Lincoln would have been able to end slavery in a timely manner?
I'm not sure. The point you're making about Lincoln's disappointment in Meade, I think demonstrates what Lincoln wanted, which was he wanted to destroy Lee's army. This was part of his view, his strategic view that of really total war, that you have to destroy the army of the enemy. He was deeply disappointed because he didn't have a full partner in Meade, in General Meade, who would stand with him and follow that out. That's an example of the frustration that a visionary has when he doesn't have a partner to work with him and carry out his vision. Now, the second part that you ask about having to do with if the war hadn't, can you reframe that? I didn't quite get the second part.
So do you think that, well, let's assume that the war had ended in 1863 with the crushing of Lee's army. If that were the case and the circumstances were so different for a reconstruction and readmission of Southern states to the Union, how do you think, knowing Lincoln's strategic planning, that Lincoln would have been able to end slavery, not when Lyndon Johnson signed the civil rights measures in the 1960s, but do so much, much sooner than 1865?
Well, I'm not a fan of conjecture, but I would just say that given Lincoln's personality and what many people have brought out, which is his close attention to what the country could tolerate, what the country was willing to do, I think he would have moved with the audacious goal, the vision of eliminating slavery. But he would have seen what was possible and what was not possible. I mean, you could pose the question almost today with our current president and our current situation where the country is so deeply divided. Could our current president propose something like reparations?
No.
No. It just, it would be a disaster. Could he propose something like, given the regular police murder of African Americans, could the current president propose national standards that were enforceable for police in all jurisdictions? No, certainly not. The country wouldn't tolerate it.
Well, he could propose those, whether it would be a good idea or not, would be another measure.
Well, that makes the point that proposing radical ideas, which ideas you may hold dearly in your private heart, that's one thing. But as a leader of the country, to propose something that the country would never tolerate and would lead to your immediate plummeting of all your power, certainly you would not be reelected.
I would suggest in answer to what Rob was saying that if the war had ended and Meade had destroyed Lee's army and that had ended the war in 1863, what would have happened with emancipation, with slavery? Because all he had at that point was the Emancipation Proclamation. There was no proposal even for 13th Amendment. And I think he would have been, based on what he had done to that point, been audacious in the sense that he, and I don't recall the date, so I don't remember if it was then or later, but he did say that having made the promise, I can't go back on it. You know, he has made the decision of emancipation. He's been pushing it with the variations of it in different places for whatever might work in those places, like the border states. But he's decided that this is what's going to happen. And he said on more than one occasion that, you know, we can't just let these people that have been emancipated go back into slavery. I mean, that would be reneging on a promise. So I don't see him falling back on that. I see him pushing forward, which would be pretty audacious, I think, given the fact that he was in an environment in which it wasn't just the South that was against equality for full equality for African Americans. It was most of the North as well. So that would have taken some guts to keep pushing that, but I think he would have, based on what he did do. Of course, it's a moot point. It is speculation, but it's interesting. At least.
The model would be what he was prepared to do when he feared he wasn't going to get reelected. There's not much you can do if the South just came back in on full status and voted down your 13th Amendment. So he would have had to either try to make the institution of slavery defunct by just having so many freed people loose in the country that it'd be so difficult to restore the institution. But that it was all up to public opinion and the nature of the Reconstruction after Gettysburg. If he'd have won Gettysburg, if he destroyed Lee's army at Gettysburg, I think it would have been very difficult for him to hold up to his promise of sustaining the emancipation.
Miles Taylor in the chat has suggested a better word perhaps than cautious. He suggests calibrated. Cautious moves to maximize the prospects of victory without overreaching. And I wanted to comment on what Bradley was saying about how difficult it is to be an audacious leader, head of government in a democracy. And I think back, truly, can you think of a truly audacious, daring, damn the torpedoes leader? And I can think of one in recent, not too recent history now, but recent to me, it was Mrs. Thatcher. She didn't care what anybody said about anything. She was going to destroy, she was going to defang the labor unions. She was going to change the British economy. She was going to undo as much of the socialist state that had been built up since World War II as she could, with the exception of the National Health Service.
Where do you categorize Teddy Roosevelt?
She lasted for 11 years. But even Teddy Roosevelt had limits. He was a progressive, in many regards, but he was also an imperialist for building an American empire overseas. But I think Mrs. Thatcher is an example, the exception that proves the rule. That it's hard to, without a big parliamentary majority or big congressional majority, it's impossible to be overly audacious.
Yeah, Bradley did make a good point too about the idea that this is a democracy where there's a separation of powers and how much a president can do, but in specifically, Lincoln was very much still a Whig in mindset, and very much, as Bradley mentioned, a constitutionalist
Yeah.
who believed in the separation of powers and believed that Congress was the primary power, the primary lawmaker, and that he was the executive, to implement those powers. And this goes back as well to what Ed was saying about the Homestead Act and the Land Grant Acts. As you'll see in my book comes out, he does have some interactions, but mostly those were things that were part of the Whig and Republican platforms. And once all of the Southern Democrats left the Congress, it was just a rubber stamping operation anyway. The Republicans that were left would just pass everything that they've been trying to pass and everything like that, and he would just rubber stamp it. So there wasn't much need for him to do much.
Yeah.
But he did believe that they were the ones who were supposed to be doing those sorts of things, and he
Yeah.
did manage them to some extent, which gets me to the other part of what Miles had said, calibrated. I was trying to think of other words that might work, and thought of, like, he was deliberative, he was calculated. He says, cold, hard, calculated reason. That's the way he thought. He had, in one statement, he said that his mind was like a piece of steel. It was very hard to etch something into it, but once it was there, it was hard to get it out. It took him a while to absorb information, and then he worked. He was firm on what he wanted to do. He felt confident that the decision he had made was the correct one. Now, I don't know if that would be considered cautious or audacious, but I think it would be calculated. I mean, he had a very mathematical way of thinking, a logical way of thinking.
David and Richard, we're losing viewers here as people go about their lives. Maybe we should wrap up, and if anyone has anything to say, and then take a final vote and see where we are.
Or any final comments?
Yeah, Matt,
Yes,
and then go ahead, Bradley first. Go ahead.
Yes,
One of you go.
I have one. Two things that comes to mind that Lincoln did that was audacious for the 1860s. And we may look back on it now as not being so audacious, but at the time it was huge. And these two things that he led on. One was he was able to get finally able to get a treaty through with the Brits, a international treaty against the international slave trade. We had stopped the slave trade back in 1807, but 15 to 20,000 unfortunate Africans was coming in every year up until the 1860s. And we could never get a international slave trade. The Brits, who had the largest navy, the Southerners in Congress prevented them from helping out. Looking back at the War of 1812 and what happened there. But once they left the Congress, Lincoln was able to audaciously move to complete that treaty, and the international slave trade stopped as a result of that. That was one audacious move by Lincoln. The second, which was pretty huge at the time, was he recognized the governments of Haiti and Liberia. You have a government, the only other true republic in the hemisphere that the American government has refused to recognize or open up diplomatic relations with. Lincoln did that. He actually invited a Black Haitian ambassador here, and he was received in the State Department. That was audacious in the 1860s. So those are two things that I would say that he did on his own within the confines of Article 2 of the Constitution. That was pretty audacious for the time.
Yeah,
Matt, you had something?
Yeah, I just want to make kind of an obvious point that I don't think we've made. The danger in being too audacious is not only that you will lose on that matter, but it can destroy the whole power of the presidency. We have, again, Roosevelt's example, court packing. His defeat marked the end of the New Deal, I think generally believed. And second, that's why Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation, not throughout the South, but only in areas under Confederate control. Again, it was legal. The legal issue was there. But in addition, I think had he gone too far, that also could have backfired. So I think that's the reason there's limits to audacity.
yeah. I would also say that his handling of Frederick Douglass, having Douglass at the White House was rather an audacious move for that time as well. If you have read James McPherson's book on Lincoln as a military leader, I think it's called Trial by Fire. He was pretty audacious as a military leader. Others have pointed this out about his constant reminder that your objective is not specifically Richmond, it's the destruction of Lee's army. I thought the realization that he had greater resources and what he needed to do to win that war was the destruction of the Confederate army was considered audacious. And the fact that he didn't really, I mean, he put up with McClellan while he had to, when he didn't have any other choices, but he really wasn't very happy with the approach McClellan was trying to take. So I think all of that, if you just look at Lincoln as a military leader, he was fairly audacious, considering his lack of knowledge at the beginning.
Okay, let's take a vote and see if anybody changed their mind. And we're going to try something. At the bottom of the screen, you should see something that says reactions. Hopefully everybody sees it.
Mhm.
And if you click on it and give me a thumbs up for audacious.
Where is it?
Right at the bottom, it should be, you should see something called reactions. Hopefully you see it. That's where the hand is. And well, okay, you have either hands up or thumbs up, one of those.
Oh, I see.
And I can count them on the participant list, which is a little easier to do than try to get through the scroll through.
Yeah, bring your cursor down to the bottom of the screen.
I
Yeah,
don't see it. I don't have it.
The bottom of the Zoom screen, not the bottom of your big screen.
Bottom of the Zoom screen.
Bottom of the Zoom
Bring
screen.
your cursor to the bottom of the Zoom screen.
You should see where all the things are, like chat. There should be reactions there. We'll see if that works. So go ahead and give me a hands up or thumbs up or whatever for audacious. It doesn't seem to be working for a lot of people.
Maybe they're not voting for audacious.
Maybe. Okay, I've got, not getting too many actually.
Some people are holding their hands up.
Yeah, that doesn't work. So let's go with that. Just hold your hands up.
Carol's doing both. What does that mean?
Okay, audacious. We're going to audacious. Keep holding it up, and don't leave.
Chicago voting twice.
No,
Okay, and cautious.
no.
Carl, you only get one vote.
This is not regulated by the Federal Election Commission.
This is not even accurate. This is not even accurately counted.
No,
No, if people have their camera off, they can't vote.
can I abstain?
If your camera is off and you're holding your hand up, then I'm just gonna guess. Okay,
I did.
now
but
I
he-
will say right now that this count is not accurate because when I have to look at two different screens here. I have to scroll across two screens, and when I do that, as soon as one person leaves, it changes everybody's position.
Yeah,
And,
got
and
that
I
too.
might be seeing this one vote 12 times, so I don't know. Anyway, we lost some people. We're down to, we lost about 12 people from when we did it
Because they
before.
abstained.
No, because it's 8 o'clock. Yeah. So what we came up with, and I'm gonna ask for something. What we came up with, is we went from, I had about 20 audacious to 12 cautious when we started. I now have about 11 audacious and 13 cautious when we ended. And I'm going to ask you, if you've got a better word than cautious or audacious, just write it in the chat right now, because we'll be able, that'll get captured.
Calibrated.
I'm hiring Sidney Powell.
We might have to have a recount.
You might need a bigger bank account, because she's paying a lot of money right now to cover all the things she did.
You'll need a sanity
Make
test.
it even more.
You'll need a sanity test if you hire her.
Yeah.
Or Rudy.
I'll just start a GoFundMe campaign.
I think the bottom line here is that, first off, I want to thank Ed and Richard for presenting these two sides
Here, here.
of Abraham Lincoln. I think they did a great job and really got us to be thinking about this, which is, I think, critical, because I think the first thing that comes out of this is audacious and cautious are much too simple a terminology to use to describe somebody like Abraham Lincoln.
David Donald did this to us.
Yes. So we
He was one of many biographers.
he was one of many. And there are, and the Summon to Glory by, for example, this book by Richard Striner, that is audacious life of Abraham Lincoln. He has many examples of his audacity, but the Summoned to Glory title is a reference obliquely, not even that obliquely, reference to Lerone Bennett's book, Forced into Glory, which basically said that not only was Lincoln very cautious, but he was basically worthless as far as accomplishing any of the things that got accomplished, like emancipation, like freedom for enslaved people. I mean, all of these things. And that he also said that he was a horrible white supremacist and racist. So that's where the title comes from. There are other books, like a more recent book by Fergus Bordowich that talks, it's called Congress at War, that John O'Brien has an excellent review of in the last journal, or maybe the last one or the one before that, Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association. He basically says that Lincoln just rubber stamped all the work that Congress was doing, and that they pretty much did everything. So you can get different viewpoints, and with 15, 16,000 books on Lincoln, everybody has their own view of what Lincoln is.
Put it mildly, Noah Feldman has a different view.
Noah, I guess if you watch that tomorrow, you can see what Noah Feldman's view is, which is quite different than most of the other 15,000 books on Abraham Lincoln.
David, let me ask, how many people still on the call enjoyed this program and think we ought to do a similar program, have a discussion on a debate on a topic?
Actually, that was my next question. So we had a lot of people doing.
Raise your hand, Richard. Richard, raise your hand, Richard.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I agree. I didn't expect I would be voting on our participation, but yes.
David,
Well, if anyone thinks of another topic that we could have a debate discussion about, let us know. You can plan it ahead.
or just rebroadcast the Lincoln Forum debate about Lincoln the movie, or Peter Carmichael and Ty Sedlew on Robert E. Lee.
I would leave out Professor Carmichael's contributions to that. He was not very.
If you don't know where to send your ideas, the Lincolnian.org has contact forms on every page. Just put your comments on one of those contact forms, and I'll make sure it gets to the right person.
Okay, I agree that I from everybody that was still on here, the vast majority said that they want to do more. I have to admit, there's a bit of a self-selection bias because we lost some people between the beginning and now,
Well, it's
although
been
most
2
of them
hours.
waited until the end before they left.
In 2
So-
hours. Been 2
Yeah, it's
hours.
2 hours. So, and that happens. I mean, you always lose people at the end because they have lives and they
Yeah,
can't spend it all here.
We had an excellent turnout. We had some points, we had 50 people or more, and people come and go.
We did. We had excellent turnout and we had good contributions from all of the participants that were on the call, not just Ed and Richard.
And a very
So-
active chat, and a very active chat.
And very excellent. John, you had something.
Before you dismiss us, let's put in a plug. Earlier in the program, we listed a lot of activities that we're doing, including the Lincoln Memorial Centennial. I'm going to put a plug on the website, look soliciting your year-end donations. We need additional funds to do all the things that we like to do and I think are worthwhile. So please, if you're considering a donation, check the website. You can do it easily there. We appreciate all your support. Thank you.
And now's a good time to donate just before the end of the year so you get your tax deductions.
Those who can still itemize.
Right, those who can still itemize. So at this point, I guess I'll just say thank you. I think we will do more of these. We'll see how often we do them because we have plenty of other things that we're going to do that we want to do in addition to our monthly dinner meetings, which we hope to actually get back to having dinner next in the spring. So we'll be doing more of these. We'll be doing more of these debate discussions. We'll be doing some of these other oral history things. And if you have ideas for both topics for this type of format and even a totally different format that you think you'd like us to tackle, definitely send it along because we can do things live eventually, and on Zoom gives us a lot of options to reach people across the country. We have people from all over here on this call. So thank you all very, very much. And we will have a replay of this recording soon on the website and on the Facebook page. If you're not on either of those, connected to either of those, please do. If for some reason you're not on our mailing list, please send us your email so we can put you on. And if you have any questions about anything, you can always email me, or as John just said, go to our website, lincolnian.org, and there's an info, you can put in the info page or send an email through the info on that page. So thank you all very, very much. And again, thanks Ed and Richard for putting this together.
Thank
Very
you.
much appreciate it. It was a great idea.
Very good. Thank you. Good night to all.
Thank you. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. Well,
Good night.
Merry
Night.
Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. Bye-bye.
Dave,